The letter arrived on a Tuesday in late November, folded inside a scarf she did not recognize. She had knitted the scarf herself. She could tell that much from the yarn and the pattern, the same loose seed stitch she had used for 31 years, but she could not remember this particular one because she had made hundreds of them, given every last one away, and kept nothing for herself. The scarf was navy blue, and the wool had gone thin at one end from long use, faded in the particular way of something that had been worn, and not replaced because the person wearing it could not bear to let it go. Someone had carried this scarf for 9 years. She held it between her palms for a moment before she thought to look inside it for the letter. Vera did not know when she unfolded that letter with hands stiffened by cold and age that it would change everything she had stopped believing was possible. She did not know whose hands had carried it back to her door, or how far those hands had travelled, or what had been riding quietly on the warmth of a single wool scarf given to a stranger on a winter sidewalk 9 years before. She sat at her kitchen table with her reading glasses on and the letter in her lap and read it 3 times, and the 3rd time she pressed it against her chest and closed her eyes. And for a moment, the small apartment on the 3rd floor of the building on Clement Street was the most sacred place in the world. But that is the end of the story, and the beginning is 31 years earlier. In the winter, her husband Raymond passed. If you have ever given something away without expecting it to come back, stay with this one. It matters. Raymond died on the 8th of December, a Sunday, in the bedroom of the apartment they had shared for 22 years. He was 57 years old. The cause was his heart, which had been failing slowly for 3 years and finally decided it had done enough. They had watched it happen together, he and Vera, the quarterly appointments with the cardiologist on Geary, the medications lined up on the bathroom shelf in their amber bottles, the slow renegotiation of what he could and could not manage without admitting out loud that the list of what he could not was growing. Raymond had driven a city bus for 24 years, the 38 Geary line mostly, the long, grinding route from the ocean to downtown and back. And he had been proud of that work in the way people are proud of work that keeps a city moving and gets almost no credit for doing so. When his heart made the driving impossible, he had taken the city's early retirement package without complaint, because complaining was not Raymond's way, and he had spent his last 2 years learning to cook and watching the street from the window and telling Vera, with more conviction than she could always match, that they had done all right. Vera was 54 when he died. They had no children. What they had was each other. And then they had only the cold that came in through the window she had cracked open because Raymond always slept better with a little air. And then they had nothing but the sound of the street below and the grief she did not yet know what to do with. The cardiologist had told her 3 weeks before the end that it could be a month or it could be less. She had driven home and told Raymond what the doctor had said, and Raymond had looked at the street for a long moment and then turned to her and said, "Well, we got 22 good years in this apartment." She had not been able to say anything in response. She had put her hand on top of his, and they had sat there like that until the light changed outside and the room went from afternoon gold to the grey of early evening. She was a home health aide. She had been one for 18 years, moving from apartment to apartment across the city's western neighbourhoods, cooking and bathing and sitting with people whose families were far away or stretched thin or simply could not manage. She made $14 an hour. The work was invisible in the way that most care work is invisible, the labour that sustains a life at its most fragile, performed by a woman in a uniform in someone else's kitchen, her name known to the client and the case coordinator and almost no one else. The clients knew her, though. The clients knew the sound of her key in the lock and the particular way she rinsed a bowl and the exact temperature at which she brought their soup to the table. Not too hot, not cooling. That knowing was its own kind of being seen, even if the rest of the world did not participate in it. Raymond's pension was modest, and the savings account held just enough to cover the burial and the first 3 months of rent before she would need to go back to work. She went back to work in January. She did not have the luxury of stopping. The clients she returned to in January were a retired schoolteacher named Constance on 7th Avenue and an elderly man named Henry whose daughter called from Portland every Sunday at noon, precisely. Both of them had sent cards while she was out, plain cards with brief handwritten notes, nothing elaborate, and she had been grateful for the plainness of them, the refusal to pretend that words could do what words cannot do. She cooked Constance's oatmeal and measured Henry's medications and changed his bed linens on Wednesdays and sat at their kitchen tables and was present the way she had always been present, steady and quiet and careful. If she cried on the bus rides between their apartments and her own, she cried without sound, the way she had been raised, and by the time she reached her door, she was composed. What she did in the evenings. In the 2 weeks between Raymond's death and the first morning she had to put on her coat and go back to someone else's kitchen, was knit. She had always knitted. Raymond had teased her about the clicking of the needles in the evenings, the sound they made in the living room while he watched television or read his transit union newsletters. He said it sounded like a tiny locomotive, steady and purposeful, going somewhere. She had laughed at that and kept clicking. She had been knitting since she was 11 years old, taught by her mother at the kitchen table in the house in the Fillmore where she had grown up. The same needles passed down, the same way the knowledge was passed down, and the skill was so deep in her hands by now that she did not need to look at the work. She could knit in the dark. She could knit through grief. After Raymond died, she sat in the chair by the window where the light was good, and she knitted through the afternoons and into the evenings until her fingers ached and she slept. She finished a scarf in those 2 weeks. It was navy blue wool, thick and long, with the seed stitch she had learned from her mother. The yarn had been in her work basket for 2 years, bought on sale and waiting for the right occasion, and now the occasion was simply the need to do something with her hands that felt purposeful. She did not need a navy scarf. She had 4 scarves already and no one left to give one to. She wrapped it in tissue paper anyway and put it in her coat pocket when she walked to the grocery store that January, and on the way home she passed a young man sitting on a bus bench in a light jacket, his shoulders drawn up against the cold, his face tipped down toward the sidewalk. He looked like he was trying to disappear into himself, like a person who had decided that taking up less space was a form of survival. She'd seen that posture before. She had sat beside it in her clients' bedrooms late at night when the hardest hours came. She stopped. She pulled the scarf from her pocket and held it out and said, "Here, it's too cold for that jacket." He looked up. He was young, maybe 22, and his eyes were red, and she did not ask why. She had spent enough years beside people in their worst moments to know that asking was not always the kindness it appeared to be. He took the scarf. He said, "Thank you, Ma'am." And the words were careful, formal, the words of a person trying to hold himself together in front of a stranger. She nodded and walked the rest of the way home with her neck cold and her heart a little lighter than it had been in weeks. She did not think much more about it. It was a scarf. She had yarn at home and a pattern she could make without looking, and 2 weeks of evenings still to fill. She made another one the following week, and the week after that. And by the following November, when the cold settled back over the city in the particular way it does there, not the hard freeze of other climates, but the damp, penetrating grey that finds every gap in your clothing, she had a routine she had not planned and could not quite explain. The needles clicked in the evenings and the scarves accumulated on the shelf in her hall closet, and she gave them away as the winter required. The giving felt like the one thing she could do that cost her nothing but her time and left her feeling less alone. It felt like the locomotive. Still going somewhere, still exactly that. Every October she bought yarn at the fabric shop on Clement, 3 blocks from her building. She chose whatever was on sale, mostly solid colours, navy and grey and burgundy and forest green, occasionally something brighter if the price was right. She was not extravagant about it. She spent perhaps $40 a year on yarn, sometimes $50, and she thought of it as the one luxury she allowed herself, the one thing the budget absorbed without argument, because the alternative was the evenings in the chair with no clicking and Raymond's side of the bed still too neatly made. She knitted in the evenings after her shifts. 1 scarf every 10 to 14 days, depending on how tired she was and how complicated her clients' needs had been. Some weeks she finished one in 8 days. Some weeks she sat with the needles in her lap and did not start until she had rested enough to trust her hands. By late November she had a stack of them on the shelf in her hall closet, 8 or 10 or sometimes 12 in a good year, and she gave them away through December and into January. One at a time, to whoever crossed her path, who looked cold and without one. Bus stops were her favourite places. She had spent years taking the bus to her clients, and she knew the particular quality of a bus stop wait in winter, the way the cold finds you standing still, the way people hunch into themselves and stare at the pavement and wait for something to come. She also gave scarves to people waiting outside the hospital on Geary, the ones who had been inside for hours and had not brought a coat adequate for the season because they had been too frightened earlier that day to think about the weather. She gave one to a woman sleeping in the doorway of a closed pharmacy on Balboa, tucking it around her shoulders without waking her and stepping back onto the sidewalk and continuing home. She gave one to a teenage girl in a school uniform who had been crying on the steps of the public library and would not say why, only took the scarf with a wet face and said, "Thank you," so quietly it was nearly not a word at all. She never knew their names unless they offered. She did not ask. She said, "Here, it's cold," or "Take this, please." And then she kept walking. She was not performing generosity. She did not pause to receive gratitude or wait to see what the person did with the scarf once she had turned away. She was filling the evenings and keeping her hands busy and honouring something she could not name but felt most strongly in the winter when the light went early and the apartment was quiet, and Raymond's side of the bed was still too neatly made. The years moved the way years do when there is work to hold them in shape. Her clients changed and did not change, new names cycling in as old clients died or went to family or went to facilities. The apartment on 7th Avenue emptied and filled 3 times over, Henry passing in his sleep on a February Tuesday, and Constance outlasting everyone's predictions until she did not. Vera attended both funerals, sitting in the back of the church the way people sit when they are not quite family but not quite strangers either, which was the position her work had always placed her in and which she had long since made a kind of peace with. She was the person who held the life at its margins. That was not nothing. The margins were where a great deal of the actual living took place. She turned 60 and then 65 and then 70, and the work was still the same work, the bus and the key and the kitchen and the particular knowledge of each client's rhythms. She saved her receipts and paid her rent and bought her October yarn and gave away her winter scarves and sat in the chair by the window in the evenings with the needles clicking. And if there were stretches, sometimes weeks, when the apartment felt very quiet and very small, she had learned to be grateful for the quiet as well as the company, to hold both without requiring the one to explain the other. 31 years. Vera gave away scarves for 31 consecutive winters. She estimated one afternoon, when she had nothing else to think about, that she had made somewhere between 200 and 300 of them. She kept no record. What would be the point of a record? The world did not need her accounting. It needed the scarves. By the time the letter arrived, she was 85 years old. She had retired from home health aid work at 78 when her own knees made the transit and the stairs of her clients' buildings too difficult and too slow. She had worked for the agency for 34 years by then, and when she left, her supervisor had organised a small goodbye gathering in the break room with a sheet cake from the bakery down the street, and Vera had eaten her piece and shaken hands with people she had worked alongside for decades and gone home on the bus and sat in her chair and let herself feel what she felt, which was mostly tired and a little bit at sea, and proud in the quiet way of someone who has done hard, necessary work for a long time and never needed anyone to say so. She lived on Raymond's pension and her social security, and she was careful with money, the way people are careful who learned early that carefulness is the only savings account available to them. The apartment was rent-controlled, and she had been there long enough that the rent was manageable, and she did not need much. She cooked simple meals and watched her programs and read library books in the afternoons, and took the short walk to the fabric shop on Clement each October to buy the year's yarn. The neighbourhood had changed around her 4 times over, each wave of newcomers bringing their own restaurants and languages. But the fabric shop was still there, and the woman who ran it, Lily, who had taken it over from her own mother 15 years earlier, knew Vera by name and by scarf. In November, Lily always asked how many had gone out so far, and Vera always said not enough yet, and Lily always laughed and rang up the next year's yarn without comment on the amount. She still knitted. Of course she still knitted. Her hands were slower, and the reading glasses were the strongest prescription her optometrist offered, and she sometimes had to rest the wrists when they stiffened badly in the cold. But the seed stitch was as natural to her as breathing, and she did not need to watch her hands to do it. The clicking still sounded the way it had always sounded. She gave fewer scarves now because she could not move as far from home as she once had, and some days the knees said no, but she gave what she could. She always had. Her neighbour's daughter, a woman named Deanna, who was in her 40s and checked in on Vera twice a week with groceries and general conversation, had once asked her why she bothered. This was 3 years before the letter arrived, on a December Thursday when Vera had come back from the bus stop with her nose red and her coat damp and one less scarf than she had left with. Deanna had asked why she spent money on yarn and hours on knitting for people she would never see again, people who might leave the scarf on the bench or pass it along or lose it before the week was out. Vera had set her damp coat over the radiator and looked at Deanna for a moment, the way she looked at questions that deserved a real answer rather than a deflection. Then she said, "Because Raymond said it sounded like something going somewhere. I'm still trying to get there." Deanna had not asked again. She brought the groceries on Tuesdays and Thursdays and sat with Vera sometimes through the evening programs and understood that some questions answer themselves if you leave them alone long enough. She was a practical woman, Deanna. The kind of practical that is a form of love, and she showed it by doing rather than asking, by making sure the refrigerator had what it needed and the prescription bottles on the bathroom shelf were not running low, and the company on Tuesday and Thursday was reliable and without expectation. Her own grandmother had passed 4 years earlier, and Vera reminded her of that grandmother in some ways and in some ways did not at all, and the combination kept her coming back with a faithfulness that Vera never commented on directly but felt the weight of, especially on the long evenings. The November the letter arrived, Vera had been fighting a cold for 2 weeks and had not gone outside much. She had 9 scarves stacked and waiting, but had given away only 1 so far, left with the building's super, a taciturn man named Gus, for a boy she had seen from her window shivering at the stop below. She didn't know if the boy had taken it. She had not seen him at the stop since. She had been feeling in the way she sometimes felt in the grey stretches of late autumn, like the giving was an old habit whose meaning she had lost track of somewhere in the last few years. The feeling came and went. It was not despair, not the grief she had known in the years after Raymond, which had been large and specific and attached to him in every detail of every room. It was something smaller and vaguer, a kind of wondering whether the locomotion still had a destination or was simply moving for the sake of moving, the way old habits do when they have outlived the reason for them. She had been talking to Raymond's photograph on the dresser more than she liked to admit, asking him questions she already knew the answers to. The photograph looked back at her the same way it always had, steady and warm, present in the way photographs are present when you have looked at them long enough that you know the expression by heart. The knock on her door that Tuesday morning was Deanna, who came a day early because she had heard Vera coughing through the wall the previous evening and had decided the groceries could not wait until Thursday. She had soup and crackers and the particular brand of orange juice Vera preferred, and a small pharmacy bag with cough drops. She also had a padded envelope that had been left downstairs with her name on the building directory and passed along by Gus, who apparently knew which deliveries belonged where. The envelope had a postmark from a city in Georgia that Vera did not immediately recognise, and no return address on the outside. Only a handwritten label in careful, deliberate script, the writing of someone who had thought about each word before setting it down. Deanna set the groceries on the counter. Vera sat down at the kitchen table and opened the envelope. Inside was the navy scarf, worn thin at one end, faded from years of use, and inside the fold of the scarf was the letter. Deanna stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched her neighbour put on her reading glasses and begin to read. She watched her read it once, slow and careful, her lips moving slightly on the harder words the way they did when she was concentrating. Then she watched her read it again, then a third time. And when Vera pressed the pages to her chest and closed her eyes, Deanna came in from the doorway and sat down across the table without being asked and folded her hands and waited. The letter was from a man named Marcus. He was 31 years old and he lived with his wife and their 2 daughters in a city in Georgia. He worked in construction management and described his work briefly, but with a specificity that told Vera he was proud of it, the pride of a person who had found work that fit and done it well. He was doing all right, he said. It had taken him a long time to get there. He wanted to say something he had been meaning to say for 9 years and had not known how to deliver until recently. In the winter, he was 22, he wrote. He had been sitting on a bus bench in the Richmond district on a cold evening in January with a light jacket and nowhere particular to go and no strong feeling about whether he arrived. He did not write the full details of what that winter had contained, and Vera did not need him to. She had given away scarves at bus stops for 31 winters, and she knew what a person looked like when they were sitting at the far edge of something. He had been at that edge. He said only that it had been a hard time, the kind of hard that lives inside you differently than ordinary difficulty, and that he had been on that bench for longer than he should have been before an older woman stopped and held out a scarf and said, "It was too cold for that jacket." He took the scarf. He said, "Thank you." She walked away. He sat there with the scarf in his hands for a while before he put it on, and when he put it on, he sat for a while longer, and the cold was less cold, and the bench felt less final than it had before she stopped. He had kept the scarf. He had worn it for 3 winters until it was worn thin at one end, and the colour had faded, and then he had folded it into the bottom of a duffel bag because he could not bring himself to throw it away. He had moved twice since then, and the scarf had moved with him from the duffel to a box to a shelf in a storage unit, the way people keep things they cannot explain to themselves but cannot release. His wife had found it the previous spring when they were clearing out the storage unit together. She had held it up and asked about it, a plain question with no particular weight behind it, and he had told her the story, what little story there was, an old woman on a winter sidewalk and a scarf and a sentence about the cold, and a moment that had mattered more than the woman who gave the scarf could possibly have known. His wife, whose name was Joy, had held the scarf for a long moment. Then she had held his hand. She had asked if he had ever tried to find the woman, and he had said there was no way he did not know her name, or which building she had come from, or where she had been going that evening. Joy had considered this and said she thought there might be a way. Joy had her own kind of quiet persistence that Marcus described in the letter with the tenderness of a man still slightly awed by his wife after 7 years of marriage. She had gone to the neighbourhood on 3 separate Saturdays over 4 months, visiting the businesses nearest to that bus bench, asking if anyone remembered a woman who gave away scarves in the winter. Most people did not know what she was talking about. Some had moved in too recently. But the woman who ran the laundry on the corner, whose family had been pressing shirts at that address for 30 years, knew exactly who Joy was asking about. The woman with the scarves, she had said without hesitation. Of course. Everybody on this block knows her. 3rd floor of the building on Clement. She doesn't always come down in the winter anymore, but she's there. She's been there a long time. Joy had found the building. She had found Deanna's name listed as a contact on the building directory, and sent the letter there, addressed in the careful handwriting that said this was a thing she had thought about for a long time before doing. She had wrapped the letter in the original scarf because Marcus had decided the scarf belonged back where it came from. He had been carrying it for 9 years, and it was time to return it, not because he was done with what it meant, but because returning it was the only way he knew to say what he needed to say. The letter did not ask for anything. It offered only the account of what had happened, plainly and carefully, and the statement that the stopping and the giving had mattered more than she could possibly have known, and that he had been waiting for a way to say so, and finally had one. He had written 2 more pages after that, and Vera read them both. He wrote about Joy, about how they had met at a job site where she was a project coordinator and he was running the framing crew, and he had gotten her name wrong twice before he got it right, and she had corrected him both times without impatience, which he had recognised even then as a sign of either character or interest, and it had turned out to be both. He wrote about their daughters, Amara, who was 7, and already argumentative in the way of a child who understands that she is right more often than adults acknowledge, and Celeste, who was 4 and had recently developed a serious interest in birds and could identify 17 species by sight, which Marcus said was more than he could do, and possibly more than he ever would. He wrote that he told his daughters sometimes about the woman with the scarf, not the hard parts of that winter, just the shape of it, that a stranger had been kind to him when he needed it, and he had never forgotten. And that kindness was the kind of thing that travelled with you and did not weigh you down. He wrote that Joy had said he should put that in the letter. He had. Appended to the last page were 2 sheets of drawing paper with crayon drawings in the unself-conscious style of children who have not yet learned that some subjects are too large to draw. Amara had drawn a house with a very large yellow sun and 5 stick figures with circular heads, 2 of them labelled in careful block letters, Marcus and Mrs. Vera. Marcus had added a small note at the bottom identifying the remaining figures as Joy, Amara and Celeste. Celeste had drawn a bird, very round and orange, with what appeared to be a scarf around its neck. Vera set the letter down. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the pages, steadying herself. Then she picked up the crayon drawings and looked at them for a long time. The big yellow suns and the labelled figures and the round orange bird in its scarf. Outside the window on Clement Street, the ordinary Tuesday business went on. The buses and the foot traffic and the thin November light doing what it could. She said, "He still had it." Deanna said, "He did." Vera turned the navy scarf over in her hands, the worn, thin end, the faded colour, the seed stitch of her own making, recognised by touch. 9 years in a duffel bag, in a box, on a shelf, carried through 2 moves in a storage unit, and 3 Saturday visits from a woman who believed the world was not as large as it pretended to be. She ran one finger along the careful work of her own hands from the January after Raymond died. the clicking that had sounded like a tiny locomotive going somewhere. This was where it had gone. This was what going somewhere had looked like all along. She got up from the table, slowly, one hand on the edge for steadiness. She walked to the hall closet and opened it and looked at this winter's stack, 9 scarves in various colours, waiting. She took a breath. She chose 2 from the top, a forest green and a burgundy, and she carried them back to the table and set them beside the letter and the faded navy scarf and the crayon drawings. "I need to write him back," she said. Deanna said, "I'll get you some paper." She found a legal pad in the kitchen drawer and a pen with ink that worked and set them on the table and sat back down across from Vera without offering to help because she understood this was not the kind of help she was being asked for. Vera put on her reading glasses and held the pen and looked at the blank page for a moment, and then she began. She wrote Marcus a letter that afternoon, slow and careful, the handwriting large enough to read without straining. She told him his letter had reached her on a cold Tuesday in November when she had been sitting in her apartment wondering, as she sometimes wondered now, whether the old habit had lost its thread. She told him she did not remember him specifically, because there had been many bus benches and many cold evenings and many people who looked like they needed a scarf more than she needed to keep one. She told him that was not a small thing. It was the whole point, that she had never needed to remember because the giving was never about the remembering. Then she paused and looked at Raymond's photograph on the dresser, which she could see from the kitchen table at a certain angle, his face steady and warm and familiar, and she told Marcus about the needles and the clicking and what Raymond had said about the tiny locomotive going somewhere. She told him she had been trying to get there for 31 years. She thought, reading his letter, that perhaps she had, or at least that she was still on the way, which was the same thing as far as she was concerned. She filled 4 pages of the legal pad. She told him she was glad he had Joy, glad he had Amara and her arguments and Celeste and her birds. She said that anyone who took 9 years to find a way to deliver a thank you was the kind of person worth thanking, because that kind of patience and attention was not nothing. She said the green scarf was for him because it was the colour of something starting, and the burgundy was for Joy, because it seemed like the colour of someone who got things done. She did not have a scientific basis for either of those assessments. She wrote them down anyway. She included the 4 pages in a flat-rate envelope, along with the green and the burgundy, both folded neatly. She looked at the 2 crayon drawings for a long time before she decided. She folded them along their original creases and set them on the dresser beside Raymond's photograph, because she was not ready to be without them. She thought she might not ever be, and she thought that was all right. Then she went back to her chair by the window where the light was good, and she picked up the needles from the basket on the floor beside the chair, and she took out the skein of cream-coloured yarn she had bought at Lily's shop in October and not yet started, the lightest thing she had purchased that year. She cast on. The clicking started up again, steady and purposeful. Deanna sat on the couch with a mug of tea and did not say anything for a while, and the room was comfortable in the way rooms are comfortable when the quiet is shared rather than merely endured. After a time, Deanna said, "How many do you think you've given away?" "Over the years?" Vera did not look up from the needles. "I stopped counting. But a lot. A lot." Deanna held her tea and considered this with the quality of attention she gave to things that deserved it. The November light at the window was doing its early departure thing, the gold flattening toward grey. After a while, she said, "Do you think any others came back?" Vera worked 2 more rows before she answered. "I think," she said, "some things come back and some things don't, and it was never supposed to matter which." She paused, the needle still for a moment. "But it's nice when they do." Deanna nodded and finished the cold tea and eventually put her coat on properly and let herself out, pulling the door closed gently behind her the way she always did, with care. Vera sat with the cream yarn and the clicking needles until the light changed fully to evening, and she put the hall light on, and by the time she went to bed, she had 4 inches of a new scarf. Raymond's photograph was on the dresser with the 2 crayon drawings propped beside it, Amara's 5 figures and Celeste's orange bird, both pictures held up by the same frame sharing the same small piece of dresser in the quiet apartment. She lay in the dark and listened to the street below and thought about a man named Marcus who had kept a scarf for 9 years and a woman named Joy who had believed the world was not as large as it pretended to be and two little girls, one of whom had drawn a bird wearing a scarf, and she thought the locomotive was still going somewhere, still steady and purposeful, still not yet arrived at the last possible stop. In February, a letter came back from Georgia. Inside was a photograph, printed on plain paper, slightly grainy but warm with colour. Marcus and Joy and the two girls, all four of them on a sidewalk with bare trees behind them, their faces turned toward the camera, squinting a little into the light, smiling. Marcus and Amara wore the green and Joy wore the burgundy, and Celeste wore a small pink coat that was clearly her own, and all of them looked like people who had eaten breakfast that morning and had somewhere to be, and were glad of it. On the back, Joy had written in the same careful hand that had addressed the original envelope, "We're wearing them. Thank you for 31 winters." Vera propped the photograph against Raymond's photograph on the dresser, the two pictures leaning slightly toward each other in the way of things that belonged side by side. The cream scarf she finished in the third week of February, the same week the photograph arrived. She was proud of it. The stitch even and the length right, the kind of scarf that would keep someone warm well into March. She folded it and put it in her coat pocket on the first genuinely cold day of the month, a Thursday, and walked to the bus bench on the corner of Clement, 3 buildings down, and sat for a few minutes to rest in the late afternoon light, the way she did now on the days when the knees cooperated. A woman came and sat beside her, middle-aged, in a thin blazer and a skirt that had not been dressed for the February cold, her arms crossed against the wind, her face tight with whatever the day had required of her. Vera watched her from the corner of her eye for a moment. She recognized the posture. She had seen it at this bus stop and at the hospital stop on Geary, and at the library steps and in doorways over 31 winters, the posture of a person who is carrying more than the weather and not saying so. Vera reached into her coat pocket. "Here," she said. "It's too cold for that." The woman looked at her the way people always did, the small, surprised hesitation of an offer from a stranger, the moment of deciding what to do with it. Then she took the scarf. She wrapped it around her neck with the quick efficiency of someone who has been cold and is glad not to be. And she said, "Thank you." Vera nodded and stood up from the bench, one hand on the back of it for steadiness, and started back toward the building. The light on Clement Street was the thin, pale gold of a February afternoon, honest about what it was. The buses moved. The foot traffic moved. Her knees agreed with the going. Inside the coat pocket where the scarf had been, her hand was empty and her fingers were already curling toward the memory of the needles, the next skein of yarn already chosen in her mind, the colour still undecided. She had time to decide. She had the whole rest of the winter and the October after it, and all the Octobers that remained. Kindness has a long memory. The world keeps a ledger even when people do not. She had not needed anyone to tell her that. The needle and the bench and the walk home and the warm weight of the photograph on the dresser had told her, more than once, more than 31 times, in the particular language of small, faithful things that keep going somewhere, even when no one is watching. The clicking was already starting up again in her mind, steady and purposeful, the tiny locomotive Raymond had loved, still exactly that. If this story stayed with you, leave a word below. And if you want another story about what quiet kindness carries across the years, there is one waiting for you next.